On Friday, September 6th of 1997, 73-year-old John Devine decided to hike into Washington's Olympic National Park for a weekend's camping. The Reverend Michael Casting, John's pastor at his hometown of Swim, described him as a quiet man, good-natured and cheerful, who has a great love for the mountains. Despite his advanced age and the fact that he was legally blind in one eye, John was an experienced outdoorsman and did indeed love the mountains. He was also in impeccable physical shape for a man in his 70s and supplemented a healthy diet with daily exercises to ensure full mobility even at such an advanced age. One of John's rare hiking partners, Greg Balzer, said John often preferred to hike alone, as even younger folk struggle to match his pace. He walks very fast, he said. Sometimes even I can't keep up with him. According to John's loved ones, he had mentioned wanting to climb all 7,000 feet of Mount Baldy, using a tough, rugged mountain pathway known as the Maynard Burn Trail. Even more youthful hikers would have found this a challenge, but John had spent a great deal of time hiking around the park, and it was believed that he'd reached the summit of Mount Baldy with relatively little difficulty. John was last spotted on the afternoon of September 7th while hiking along Grey Wolf Ridge on the park's north side. He had been camping with a friend just outside the park's boundary in the Buckhorn Wilderness area of Olympic National Forest. And after setting off for Mount Baldy in the early morning, John assured his friend that he would return by the late afternoon. However, as the sun set on September 7th and John had failed to reappear at his campsite, his friend began to worry. The following morning, when John had still not returned from his hike, his friend was concerned enough to contact John's family, who swiftly reported him missing to local authorities. A dozen search and rescue personnel began to comb the area of Mueller Creek, a region believed to be John's last known whereabouts. But as darkness began to fall and no traces of John had been uncovered, the first day's search was called off. 23-year-old Jason Berry, who had been a Park Service volunteer for 2 years at that point, told local media outlets that the terrain was steep and rugged, with bushes that were so thick that it's tough to walk down the drainages. Sergeant Don Kelly of the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, who helped coordinate the search with the National Park Service, was quoted as saying, "If he was walking around up there, we would have found him by now. Same if he had fallen down and hurt himself. Although if that were the case, there's a chance that we're not going to find him alive." After park rangers conducted an initial search of the park and failed to discover any trace of the missing John, more expensive assets were co-opted to aid in the search. One of these assets was a Bell 205A1 rescue helicopter, piloted by 35-year-old Kevin Johnston of Springfield, Oregon. He was joined by 52-year-old Rita McMahon, a search volunteer who trained dogs to help with rescue missions, and 31-year-old Taryn Hoover, a seasonal park employee who could help Kevin navigate the proposed search areas. On one flight, they were joined by a trio of other passengers and took off from the mountainside before flying up to the 5,000-foot level of Mount Baldy. Then, about halfway through the proposed flight path, the helicopter's pilot thought he'd spotted someone walking through a snowdrift who fit their missing person's description. Those in radio contact with the helicopter and its pilot noted that after spotting the person they believed to be John Devine, the crew attempted to gain their attention while flying a little lower to the mountainside. Then suddenly, the pilot somehow lost control of the aircraft, and the helicopter went careening into the mountainside. The crash killed 3 crew members and severely injured the remainder, who were rushed to the Olympic Memorial Hospital in nearby Port Angeles. Once they were lucid enough to be questioned in relation to the crash, the survivors had chilling stories to tell. One claimed that after gaining the attention of the person on the ground, the helicopter was suddenly struck by something which sent it into a tailspin and caused it to crash. Another survivor claimed that it was a freak gust of wind that downed the chopper, but the fact remains that the only 2 people who really knew what caused the crash had been killed when the aircraft smashed into the mountainside. There were no prior reports of mechanical troubles with the helicopter, and the crash was such a mystery that a National Transportation Safety Board investigator and representatives of Bell Helicopters, Helijet, and the engine manufacturer were sent to the crash site. To this day, the exact cause of the crash has never been fully established, and with the only real clue being the unintelligible screams of terror that preceded it, it's unlikely that we'll ever know what the true cause was. At the request of his loved ones, the larger search effort was suspended just a week after John's disappearance. They were still reeling from the news of the helicopter crash deaths, and argued that John would be devastated that lives had been lost in the search for him. He wouldn't want these people putting themselves at risk for him, said a close neighbor of his. He would have said, "Back off, I know that." But in spite of the wishes of his family and friends, Olympic National Park personnel promised to continue looking for John through routine patrols of the Mount Baldy area. The case isn't closed until Mr. Devine is found, park spokeswoman Barb Main said. But it was the consensus of the search team that, with bad weather setting in and 6 days without even a clue as to where he might be, the chances for survival are really quite slim. Sadly, John Devine was never found, and he was declared legally deceased just a few years ago. But disturbingly, he wasn't the only experienced hiker to become lost in the Olympic National Park that year. Back in June, 21-year-old Port Angeles resident Chris Wursler became lost while on his first solo overnight backpacking trip. A lot was made of the fact that it was his first solo trip, as it implied that Chris was an inexperienced amateur. However, Chris had been on many backpacking trips prior to getting lost, and was by no means incapable of fieldcraft and navigation. He entered the park in early June and was expected to return home on the evening of June 6th, but it took Chris almost 2 weeks to re-emerge from the woods. Just like John Devine, an extensive search effort had failed to pinpoint his location, and following his re-emergence, search and rescue teams were very interested to know exactly where he'd been. Yet when Chris was asked to describe how he'd gotten lost, he had few memories of his time in the park and described feeling disoriented for several days. He only seemed to remember his first and final few hours in the park, and had somehow survived for almost 2 weeks on a small amount of food and water. Whatever happened to Chris might well be to blame for John Devine's disappearance too, as aside from a freak accident, there aren't many other explanations for why such an experienced and hardy hiker might disappear. In the aftermath of John's disappearance, a wave of shock and grief crashed over his family, friends, and neighbors. "It's like lights have gone out in the neighborhood," said one person who knew him. But as the grief passed, questions remained. Who or what took John Devine that day? And could it be responsible for the many other disappearances that have occurred in our nation's national parks?